Okay, this is Senate Appropriations. It's March 28th. We are talking about FY26 budget, and this is something that was not in the governor's recommend, but it was something in the House as passed budget. And I'll let you introduce yourself and just explain it, but it's about the Urban Search and Rescue Team.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And we do have a presentation, if you could throw that up. I'm going to run through some of this because I think you guys, we have a short period of time, and I think we're aware, maybe not selling the program. It did make its way into, 493, it looks like, your big bill.
Would you say your name?
Oh, David DiBiase, sorry.
And are you current chief?
I'm the City of Virginia's fire chief. I'm also the second vice president of the Vermont State Firefighters Association, and I was the deputy commissioner for Bills and General Services until about December. So I have some unique knowledge of the relationship there and some of the pieces. I also have Deputy Chief Ellsworth here from Barrie City, who has testified, I believe, on some of these items before and what that means to the local areas that get services from these folks. So I appreciate the time and opportunity to have some conversation about the importance in getting these folks funded so they can continue to do the great work that they do. So,
are you able to do that, Al? Or
we don't usually share.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. We have it on.
You guys have it with you? Great. I can follow around. That's perfect. Okay. So that first slide there, I don't know why the colors got all goofed up, but it is, just an overview of the USAR team, as I'll call it, as the Urban Search and Rescue Team. They're about 90 members strong of firefighters, EMTs, doctors, engineers, K9 handlers, and there's one full-time staff that's associated with that program currently through the Department of Public Safety, Division of Fire Safety. So they've been around quite a while, and I won't.
How many people?
90 part-time, temporary part-time employees of the state of Vermont work for the USAR team. This came out of 9/11 very slowly. There was pieces and parts that got put together. They were actually only formed through the legislation last year of the act to put them in as a statutorily sanctioned group, which was fantastic. And I think this committee, and we really do appreciate the legislature really pushing these things through because to be fair, we have not seen it as much into the governor's recommend, which is why we're having some conversation. I know there's a lot of support there. There's some miscommunication around the funding that is actually being used to prop this team up, is a good way of saying that. So that's the first slide. They do the swiftwater rescue, the rope rescue, confined space, structural collapse. So when the state of Vermont, as we have been inundated in the last couple of years, and I'm sure all of us are tired of hearing about floods, and hopefully we don't have to talk about them much more in the future. But I think the reality of the situation is we know that those are more reoccurring events for us. And this group oversees not just the rescues, right? Like they have the teams, the members that go out in the boats. They're also overseeing the state's response very much hand in hand with Vermont's emergency management. So days, if not the week before, they're sitting through these meetings, they're planning to say, hey, do we need extra teams from out of state? Do we need to request federal resources? Where do we use the MOA teams, the teams that have an agreement with Vermont Emergency Management, like the City of Virgins, like the many others, about 12 or 13 in the state? Where do we put them? Do we pre-deploy these folks so that if that place is going to get isolated, we have rescue resources in the area that can respond very quickly? They're located in Colchester, in the former V-Trans facility that was no longer good enough for V-Trans, but they needed a home and we pushed them in there. And so during my time as deputy commissioner, we spent a lot of time with Commissioner Morrison as her really number one priority was a facility that would house both the USAR, the hazmat team, which is also housed in this facility, as well as the Vermont State Police Recreation Division, which is kind of stranded currently at the former Williston State Police Barracks. So that was a huge priority. The issue always came to be that USAR had zero funding. They had no reoccurring funding that was a baseline for them to even budget these expenses, such as a lease. We worked through capital build program with Alice, and we made it pretty far, but the cost of construction, as everybody knows, and the needs of this state, which again, as deputy commissioner, we were at the forefront of prioritizing those needs, was just so great that it was hard to find $15 to $20 million to build this really big facility to house all of these groups. So at this point, I don't know if you guys are aware, there was a request last year for $750,000 that kind of came through. The act created the group, which was fantastic. It got some one-time money. but that was it, and we were never able to make it any further with reoccurring funding for them to be able to say, hey, we can lease a space that will serve the needs of the state of Vermont.
Is all that money spent, you know?
They are right down to the drags of it. I know that they are because they're had to actually cancel some training because they couldn't, they were concerned about being able to have funding through the rest of the year to make that work. The request that came through this year started at 950. That was the 750 that was originally talked about last year, and $200,000, which was really just the lease cost of leasing them a facility. It's a facility that they've looked at and actually operated in before in Milton. And as we've talked through some of these slides, that group has had various funding mechanisms, but many times it's the tier 2 funding from the hazmat group that they're using some of that funding from there, which is really not the intent of that. The state has the state Homeland Security program, grant program through Vermont Emergency Management and the federal government, which I think everybody's read the news, and I'm sure this conversation's been had in this room many times recently about what that means for our local entities. Yeah. But that grant is really what has been propping up when they get it. The salary for the program manager is grant-based. And these are the people that we rely on to come out in the middle of a storm and save us off the roof of our house. So for the state, people like us, and I'm sure the chief would agree, the thought of not having these teams at the ready that are just well-suited to respond to local communities, and that's really what we're talking about. There's not many communities in the state that could hold on their own without other resources coming in as we do as Vermonters to shore up the response that's needed. And most times we're bringing in out-of-state resources, and if not federal resources. And if we've seen the headlines the last couple of days, there's some concern as to what FEMA may become. Who knows? And I don't think we get into that, but we certainly rely on those federal resources very heavily, like in 2023, to come up and really help the state do what we need to do to get people out of at least that response phase, and then in the long term of recovery phase, which, as we all know, is a very long phase.
Did you have to use some of your money for Feast for Space to AOT or VGS for that?
They don't pay fee for space today. They pay no fee for space. The V-Trans has been great. I know that they do want Secretary Flynn had told us they would love to have that space back for their own use, but they do not pay for fee for space today, which is really, again, why they've been able to kind of go out of shoestring budget here.
Do we know what AOT wants it to use it for?
I do not know. They use part of it still for their sign shop and some other things in some geological services in the rear of that building. And there's some pictures in the slide showing what that facility looks like today. So we talked about it was formally established.
We can talk to the chair of transportation.
There you go. Absolutely. We talked about all that. So if we're down to slide 3, it's really the first line of protection for the state of Vermont. So when we deploy, we activate these groups. When we activate even the National Guard resources, many times with high water vehicles, these folks fall underneath Vermont Emergency Management, but really the director of the program, Mike Cannon, is operating and putting them all the chess pieces on the board to say, here's where we need to go. Here's where we have the resources. Here's where we don't. Their National Weather Service is calling them. They're having these chats all day long. But this group with Vermont Emergency Management, really, really close relationship there, is making sure that we are as prepared as we can be for the unknowns that continue to hit the state of Vermont, unfortunately. Over 267 Vermonters were rescued by this team over the last 18 months. That's a lot of folks. And can I tell you what their outcome would have been if they were not otherwise interacted with because of the team and the oversight of this group? I can't tell you, but I can tell you that their odds are a lot less optimistic if there was an injunction from these folks to risk their own lives. And these people, as we talked about, are part-time employees in the state of Vermont. These are people that are leaving their homes. In the case where they went to South Carolina this year to help our neighbors down there, who are a very close mutual aid asset of the state of Vermont. We rely on them many times frequently. We create a relationship. It could be weeks that they're going away to help save others, which, you know, we know is a wonderful thing. But I think sometimes we forget when we say, oh gosh, look at the USAR team out there doing this great work. These people have left their jobs, they've left their loved ones, and they're doing whatever it takes, hoping that they get the job done for the state.
And do they get paid?
They get paid. They do. It's pretty minimal.
Yeah,
they do get a little something.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, these 267 Vermonters that were saved, Chief, is that basically within the Addison, Washington County area where the majority of the serious floods took place?
Yeah, I think you'd find Washington, some of the southern Ludlow area got hit hard, right? And then we had that crazy 6 inches of rain in the St. Johnsbury area that I was still working for the state then. We were watching things. Nobody knew it was coming until Mike Cannon got a call at 2 in the morning from National Weather Service saying, oh my goodness, this thing's going to be catastrophic. You guys need to activate resources. And so, yeah, I think, but primarily Washington County, as we know, my team came up, we operated oh goodness, Richmond and Bolton and those areas. And our team under that oversight was 24 folks, a couple birds, which was interesting for us, and cats and dogs and everything else. But those people, who knows what would have happened if there wasn't somebody watching out. And that's really the shiny parts of the boats and trucks, and those are really important things to have, but their ability to oversight and really coordinate a response at a state level is huge, and I can't understate how important that is.
In case of these natural disasters or whatever else, it would be of your opinion, it's not this team, if they're deployed again, or just when they're going to be deployed?
It's when. They do about a dozen. And the other thing, we're really talking about flooding because that's the big one that makes a huge impact. They also do a lot of response for the Division of Fire Safety. So if there's a catastrophic fire or somebody's injured or possibly a fatality and the building is not secure for investigation, they come in and shore that building up. If there was a building collapse or partial collapse in the state of Vermont, it is the only state asset that has the ability to come in and shore. They bring their structural engineers in, they look at the building, they have the timber, lumber, or other expertise to shore that building up. So it's safe enough to either do a rescue, a recovery, or an investigation. So flooding, huge piece of this, but also what they do a lot of times, many times throughout the year for the state of Vermont is these fire investigations and helping out the Division of Fire Safety, ensuring buildings are safe. So we had some awful earthquake, God forbid. This would be our first line. We had a parking garage in Rutland that we had some issues with. They were, as BGS, the state owns, they were great. Sent their structural engineers down to look at it with us to make sure the hazard was minimal or that we could otherwise wait until we could fix and get the real money that we needed to repair these things. So great asset to the state during the sheltering. I call them the Swiss Army knife when we did the emergency sheltering. I think last spring, right when the program was running out the first time for the inclement weather program, they were the folks running around grabbing the pillows from the warehouses, moving the cots up here. And during COVID, they did a lot of the stand-up vaccine sites. So we're talking about the shiny stuff, but behind the scenes, this group is like the people that we have left that aren't otherwise assigned to jobs as FTEs in the state of Vermont to go do, I say, random tasks in an emergency.
And you also do, I can't remember the technical term, but basically a rescue on a cliff or in a...
Yeah, high angle and low angle rope rescue, absolutely. So these folks are in canine rescue, right, and recovery. So they have a group of canines that'll go in looking for expired individuals or live finds in a rubble pile, and they train at Camp Johnson, which is really wonderful that we have that relationship with the military department. And I should also say, and I usually say this in the beginning of my spiel here, is I'm no longer a state employee, and we know that it's sometimes difficult if things do not make it into the governor's recommend to otherwise come back and get some traction here, which is all fair. And I know that there's a lot of support over there, but the Vermont State Firefighters Association and the local communities do feel very strongly about having this resource that is able to help the city of Virgins when things go really, really horrible. And I'm sure the chief here would echo my sentiments, as you guys have had them in town more than a couple times.
Twice in 2 months, and then the coordination is immense. Being able to coordinate ahead of time to deploy resources and to see exactly where we need to go. We do use them for evaluation purposes with their drone services, and actually heads up with the coordination with river levels and the direct lead to national weather. And so just to add to the chief's thing is that they deploy in state or on average about 20 times a year. The average deployment is roughly about a week to 2 weeks because it's labor intensive. They need to circulate through. But in central Vermont, we utilize them immensely here in Berry City, that we could never replace the additional expertise and just the support that we would need to rescue our folks. So,
and just for the record, state your name.
My name is Deputy Chief Joseph Allsworth of the City of Berry, and I'm also president of Capital Fire Mutual Aid, which represents 30 communities in central Vermont.
And so as the chief just said, and as we break down through this, again, I'm not going through every slide, we're going to hit some high points here. 22 incidents in 2024, 21 of those being in Vermont, and 1 being the deployment to Hurricane Helene. And I only bring that up again is to say that these relationships that our team goes down, they operate at this very, very high level. Those are FEMA reimbursed at this point. exercise. They don't cost the state. Sometimes we make a couple of dollars on those things because of the rates it's kind of a bidding piece that goes through the EMAC request. But when we create those relationships, it also creates it back to us. So when we reach out to the nation and say, hey, Vermont's expecting to get 5 to 6 inches of rain, we need help. We've now got relationships with these states that have, we don't have as many waterways as our coastal friends do. We may not have as many resources, but they are very willing to help, and we've created these really great relationships that it's reciprocal in nature, that we're not always just asking for help. So very important. Apparently the things that occurred they saw in the Carolinas, the statement from the team was, take what we saw in Vermont times it by 100, and you're probably not quite there yet. And as we get down into, you see the couple statistics here in the next slide, with a house that's fallen in, that's a South Carolina picture. And then as we get down to the next one, we'll see the building and how close the vehicular units are inside of that. Yeah. So most of the time they need to put that thing in with a forklift, all the trailers. As you see in the notes, there's no fire protection in the building. So the entirety of the state's assets that we own, probably $5 to $6 million worth of equipment, is stored in this structure without fire protection. The bathrooms are not adequate. There's no classrooms. You'll see a picture of the next slide is the only office to be used for this group. There's no place to sleep. So when we bring in teams and we're here for multiple days, either on standby or in activation, there's no sleeping quarters for these folks. They make do. I got to tell you, I was on this team for a period of time, and I slept in some meeting rooms in Bennington and places that we are deployed. But when we're at an activation like we were in 2023 and some of 2024, when we're talking maybe a month long, those folks are going out downrange or in the field every day. That's a long time to be asking folks to just make do with what we can find in our own state. It's one thing when we sign up to it to go out of state, and they do it. Gosh, they do a heck of a job, but something to be highlighted. But no training rooms, so there's just no area to have trainings for them except for on the rubble pile, which is where they do live most of the time, exercising the dogs and their rescue equipment. No parking, so that's a big one too. So they share that again with V-Trans, that same complex at the fort. So when there is an activation and you get 45 or 50 members coming in, there's almost no parking, because V-Trans still uses that parking lot in the DMV for CDL testing and all of those programs at that.
You know where this is, President?
Yeah.
Yeah.
40th now.
Yeah.
Oh, that's where
it is. And then the next couple are just more pictures of that facility and what they're working with today. The bathrooms are not one of the nicer places that I've ever visited, but that's what they've got today, right? That's what we're working with. And then if you go to the one where there's 4 pictures, there's a boat going in a front door. I always like to ask people, there's 2 from South Carolina and there's 2 from the state of Vermont. Is there any idea which ones are which? Because without knowing,
2 photos.
There's 2 photos in there that are from the South Carolina deployment, and there's 2 photos from the state of Vermont.
Maybe the
Bottom left,
top
North
left
Carolina.
is South Carolina.
That's
I'm
what
looking
I
at the soil color. That's what
Not vastly different though, right? When we look
Yeah,
at terrain, and we look at types of species that we're dealing with, and we talk about erosion, and we talk about rain, the 2 on the upper right and bottom left are the state of Vermont. The other 2 are South Carolina. So we had at least one right. I didn't let you get all the way there. But the point is to say, these things happen, and luckily we've been straight our hurricanes in quite some time, but the weather pattern and the soils and the types of trees and vegetation all contribute to what we see for this runoff and these flooding incidents, as you guys are well aware, and I know I'm preaching to the choir on many of these things. So just more of a fun. And then next slide here showing the entire country. So the states in green, this was during Hurricane Helene, and the states in blue were all the states that had to send resources to support that one incident of hurricane. So when we look at what happens to a state like Vermont that has minimal resources already, we're working off shoestring, I shouldn't say budget. Whatever, luckily you folks have been wonderful, and I really want to put that out there, because without this group and both the GovOps groups, they wouldn't have had anything the last 2 years. So I know that number was reduced. I think the point for today for us is to say reoccurring funding, and whether that's at the 450 or some mark there, reoccurring funding, or some language to otherwise ensure that DPS has to submit a budget regardless of how they feel things are coming through. That is the bigger hope. We'll continue to make it work. They've done it for years. Luckily for us, it has not been quite as busy as they've become in the last couple of years. And I don't think any of us think things will go the other way. Hopefully they do, right?
Yeah.
I'd love to be baffled by brilliance and see that comes back the other way wholeheartedly, but, you know, a year to the date, we had, again, horrendous flooding to the state that required these folks to go out. 2 weeks ago, they were where did they get staged down your way?
They were actually went to Moretown.
Moretown, yeah.
In that area.
So we thought the rain, the snow melt, these things, it triggered an event large enough to be concerned about, so they pre-staged 2 teams out in these wonderful places that they have a great relationship with. They put them up in the firehouse for the night. Hopefully things blow over, they get to go home. This event they did, but that happens many times throughout the year too, where, hey, let's just be safe. Let's get some folks here. We know this is a prone community. We know that they'll become isolated. We know we won't be able to get there from Colchester or somewhere else. So let's put resources where they belong. So yeah, just to kind of gives you a scale of what it takes to run a massive incident and how many people, and that's why, you know, the fear of this FEMA is the national teams are such a huge resource for states like Vermont. We have the closest one in Massachusetts. It takes them 18 hours though. So from the time that we say go, the paperwork is through, it's an 18 hours of them to get their folks together, load the trucks up and drive to the state of Vermont border. And then then we start activating them. So 18 hours is a long time when somebody's hanging from a roof, or trying not to float down the river in a car. And then the last couple here, talked about the part-time employee, we talked about funding. So again, I think there's just a misconception on where that funding stream currently is. There isn't one, and if you guys are more adept to the budget than I ever will at this committee, I'm sure. But if you look through DPSs, it's missing, and it's been asked for the last couple of years through the governor's recommended, has not made it there. The feedback that we have heard through the grapevine, and I know that money is so tight for everybody, so I understand no ups. But at the same time, this one we just are very fearful of what occurs if this team is not funded to some extent, and we're not working towards the ultimate goal of fully funding these guys. And
So what happened before there was funding that we did last year? Public safety paid the.
Public safety found it, right? So they found it through the Hazmat Tier 2 fund, which is from chemical, and I'm not an expert there, but the Hazmat
The
team.
same thing that pays for the one that has met.
That's right. So, and what happened last year for the Hazmat team, which is why I think some of the one-time funding came through, was they're going to need their money, right, to replace a truck that'll be well over $1 million. There's no doubt in my mind. Fire trucks today, I seen them up there, just bonded one for $2.3 million for a truck that used to cost $1 million. So they're looking at what their needs are and going, hey, we need to somehow bring some money back in here. We can't continue to fund all of this. And then the grant program, right? So that the state has a state Homeland Security grant program. But what happens with that program is, the more the state uses it, the less the municipalities are able to access. So every one of our communities, and a lot of us apply, the fire departments, certainly the police departments, the more the state uses, that bucket shrinks. It's the same bucket.
Was that?
The state Homeland Security program grant. And so that we give it mostly to the state, the city of Virginia, the town of Barry, the city of Barry, there's less there for us to look for because we know that we have a need and we're kind of propping up our need with federal, and hey, these folks will continue to go after grants. There's no doubt in my mind. Right. But right now, that's the only way that they operate is to make sure that they pay the salary of the only full-time employee of this program is through granting. So that's a big piece of this, and I know we're short and I'm right at my limit here. So I think to just wrap it up for myself, and certainly the chief here, if he's got something else to say for us, is reoccurring funding should be the thing stamped on my forehead as to not so concerned that number dropped. Like ideally, that's not where it wanted to be, but we appreciate the heck out of it coming from where they are at zero. But the reoccurring model of, I love coming up here. I love seeing everybody, but at the same time, having to come up every year and, just beg for money that we've already started doing one-time money year to year. It seems that there should be some baseline budget for these folks, and then we'll build up that capacity as money's tight, and then who knows when that point is. But
and what Chief Schwartz told me that part of it is you're trying to do this lease for another building in Milton, and that lease would be like 400 or 450,000 a year.
200 something thousand, I think, is the lease cost. And again, this is a building they were in pre-COVID. And it was before my time at BGS, so I'm not sure what happened with that lease. But when we went back to market, and I visited, I don't know, half a dozen or a dozen buildings with these folks, and it always came back to VSP had the money, Hazmat had the money, USAR had nothing to give.
Right.
And so there was no way to get them out of this situation. If you really do spend some time looking at those pictures, I'm sure they'd love to give anybody a tour. One day I went up there was no window. So what happened to your window? It's just plexiglass. Well, birds flew through it. Okay, what happened up there? Oh, there was a mouse that chewed through that, and the belt started burning up, and we didn't know. Okay, and this is the entirety of what the state owns, except for there's boats throughout the MOA teams that have them, that are state property that we use in that response method. This is it. So that stuff all burns up or something horrible happens to it, and we can't replace it. That's where we're sitting. And so 750 included the program, capital, because there's no capital. It's whatever they get for granting, or you guys one-time money was, again, huge. So, so that's my spiel. I appreciate the time, and I know that team, they work it every day, and they just come in and they don't whine about it. They're just those type of folks that just continue to put their nose down and do their job. So,
in thinking about AOT, when they build the central garage, that might be an opportunity to build a building for USAR and hazmat. And all
sure. I think the hard part, we looked at location, right, of that facility, and most of the members of the team, they're from all over the state, are in Chittenden County, in that area surrounding. There are certainly some, we got like River, they're all over, but the majority are up in that area. So getting the travel time down, but we looked at that with Vermont Emergency Management for a new EOC because of the issues that we have. Not Waterbury flooding anymore, right? WSCC doesn't flood, but the roads surrounding it.
Did you look at the new site?
We did look at that. Well, the new proposed site, the piece of land that they were looking at, we worked with Secretary Flynn during my time with VGS. It's a great law. I think it may just be too far this way for the majority of the people that are employed by that group in the resource. But I think this group is really, beggars can't be choosers sometimes, right?
And is the lease 200,000 for the whole building, or that would be USAR's?
No, I think the USAR and hazmat would come together because they're both in hazmat truck one, which is the main Chittenden County area, is stored also in that building in some of their trailers. I didn't give those pictures, but that team and Patrick are doing a lot better on the financial side and have the wiggle room to accommodate theirs.
And did you say AOT wanted this chunky building?
Yeah, I don't know if it's just storage or what they were doing with that, but there was definitely conversation from the group with my town BGS. They'd love to have that facility. And they weren't pushing out, right? They've been excellent. I think Secretary Flynn, as we all know, is a public safety guy through and through, and they were always very wonderful. But they're outgrown the space before they started, and the facilities that we're offering employees that come. Really, I say volunteer because it's probably 20-something bucks an hour to come put your life on the line. Yeah. And with no benefits associated with that, is that we can't give them a proper bathroom or a place to have a break or take their lunch.
Or the training.
In the training, right? We brought the commissioner from BGS there, and I think we almost left after the bathroom was visualized because, again, we're the building people, right? And these are folks in the buildings, not our building, because V-Trans oversees their own, but just not to the level of expectations that the state had for any other state employees.
Okay. Any questions?
Do you know Ken Morton?
Chief Martin from Williston. I've met Chief a couple times. I do not know him well, though. Okay. Yeah, I know the person who replaced him, Chief Collette. He's a USAR team member, and he's one of the leaders of that group.
Terrific guys.
Terrific folks, and this team is just terrific. I can't say enough good things.
Okay.
So we appreciate your time.
Yeah.
Anything else?
I just wondering where this will go.
USAR would be under public safety, because that's kind of where your house, that's where the money would go to public safety.
Division of
Public safety would use
require us in public safety division.
So if I may, thank you for hearing from me. I think the state has already invested some monies. The federal government has invested monies in this team. I think in the fire service, we look at the high risk, low frequency. Just to note that Washington County is ranked second in the nation for that they now have most declared disasters, which we don't like to tout that, but that's actually the fact.
Yeah.
And so we're looking to support USAR and coming to you folks to say, listen, they need to be fully funded. They need to have recurrent funding, not to have to come back here and say, like a broken record. But I also think that the investment in these smaller communities that benefit from that, like the town of Moortown, that could never fund a USAR team to respond to their the flooding. Middlesex is another one. there's absolutely no way they can do that. And so, I really urge you to address this now because, climate isn't gonna change right off. These, occurrence of flash flooding and high water incidences are not gonna change. And we cannot wait, for deployment of an out-of-state team, 18 to 24 hours, or even the National Guard, because they have to pre-deploy those assets. That's something that Chief Cannon's doing right now, is that pre-deploying, knowing what's gonna happen in the area, and say, hey, listen, we're gonna try to get these assets ramped up ahead of time. And so I really urge the committee, now's the time to act, now's the time to put your foot down, and now's the time to properly fund and, provide the recurrent funding so that we can address those high risk, low frequency incidents that this team is specialized in doing, that we can draw from. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much for the time. Appreciate it.
And if we have any other questions, we'll track down.
Yeah.
I'll reach out to Will.
Absolutely. Yeah. He's always fun. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
You know, there's some discussion. Are we still on record? There's some discussion whether it still is or not. Some of our badges have changed to smallest city in Vermont. Or the city of Vermont, so. Have a good day.
Thank you. All right, Hardy, do you want to talk about internal service funds?
I would love to.
Yeah.
I
You're probably just waiting for the request to come in.
typically come before, these committees to talk about the most boring subject matter, possible. I'll try to be as dynamic as I can and, not just read.
These are inherently good luck.
Read from a script, but, my understanding, so first Holly Parent, was asked to come here. She's the CFO of the Agency of Administration. They are the accounting shop that does the accounting for a majority of the internal service funds, but not all. She reached out to me and thought that, based on JFO, a little bit more of an understanding about like why we do this form of duplicative appropriation, which can be very confusing. And, you know, what are the reasons how does it really work and why do we do things the way we do? And that's kind of what I am going to try to give you an outline of. There was a handout, I believe.
We didn't print it out, but it's on the website under your name.
And if you don't, and I'm not just going to, walk through it, although I may use it as a bit of a guide. What I will say is it's something I do think is actually worth your having as a legislator. This is one piece of paper I would actually maybe print and keep as a reference material. Just a suggestion. This was prepared as a guide for legislators about 5-6 years ago. The numbers in here, it's got numbers sort of as reference on all the major internal service funds. That's useful, and it talks about the components that are in them. I watched some of the testimony yesterday when I heard I'd be coming here, for instance, ADS. A one-pager on the ADS Communications and Information Technology Fund in here may make things clearer than the conversation yesterday. For instance, sometimes it's easier, at least for me, to see things broken out in a graph. Here are the different recovery mechanisms. Here's how much is allocation versus demand. So just a recommendation. I think this might be useful to you, and I would encourage keeping it as a reference material, kind of on an ongoing basis. I'm only gonna read a couple of the highlights off the first page, which is very high level. What's an internal service fund? So we've really got two types, I guess, of ways they work. One is allocation, which you take the cost of a shared activity or service, and that could be like state liability insurance for the whole state, workers' comp insurance for the whole state. It could be our HR and financial accounting system costs. Those are different internal service funds. For instance, most of my department, finance and management, is recovered by this accounting cost that's then allocated statewide. DHR.
Is it always on per person other than?
It's not always. It's not always, and that's a great question. So most of them are headcount based. But then within that, there are some subtleties. So for instance, workers' comp, it's allocated on a headcount-based formula. So we're self-insured, by the way, like we're, instead of buying workers' comp insurance on the market, you know, we collect by billing departments, put it in a fund, we pay claims out of that fund. We look at how the fund's doing, revenue versus expenses, and then set that rate for the next year. But like if you've ever been involved in a business that has to buy workers' comp insurance, you know how there are different rates depending on the type of business. And so we're not subject to that same kind of, you know, national insurance, you know, standard, you know, the stuff that comes out of DFR and national actuaries, but we do internally try to look at experience of departments. And so they have, they're not a straight headcount base. So for instance, in a department like DOC, they may be paying more per person than a clerical function department like finance and management. So it is headcount, but some variation there. Another one that's now liability insurance, that's pretty much straight across the board headcount. You get into property insurance, it's a little different. It's a combination of an allocation, but then certain buildings are, the policy is only for that building. So all the statewide costs are allocated on the statewide method, but for certain, you know, certain policies that are then for only a certain building, well, then it goes to only the department associated with that building, or it rolls through the fee for space. Fee for space, so we've got the allocated ones, which are mostly headcount. Actually, I should say, we do it differently in the financial management and human resources fund, which is we also refer to as the vision fund in shorthand after the name of our accounting system. That one, we actually account for the costs that are associated with the DHR component and the costs associated with the finance and management accounting system component. And then we split that up. And the costs that are associated with the DHR pieces, meaning running the payroll system and all the administration with that, that's actually billed out not as part of the human resources ISF, but as part of the vision, you know, the finance and HR IT system ISF. The HR related costs are billed out by a head count. The accounting system related costs, which includes like our staff of over 20 financial operations people in DFM, as well as the ADS costs of actually running that system, that database, the finance system. We actually use a different formula kind of based on number of transactions, which kind of makes more sense. So the number of transactions and volume of transactions. So it's still an allocation statewide, but different than headcount.
Okay.
So those are most of our allocation-based kind of internal service funds. We've got others that are demand-based. So for instance, the property management fund, that has to do with properties that we rent and that are used by certain functions that sort of pay, you know, internally. Only the people that are renting buildings get billed by the property management fund. That's not allocated statewide. Fleet management funds, another example. Only departments renting vehicles pay. It's not just assumed. So those are demand-based. So think about shared costs that are allocated statewide versus there are also specific costs. They got to be managed by one place, like the BGS fleet, but then they do billbacks based on whether that thing is being used or not. That's demand-based. ADS, who talked to you yesterday, they're a little more complicated because they're both allocation and demand-based out of the same fund, and it's a little more confusing when you just look at it from the high level. You have to look at the different mechanisms. You know, there is a page on the CIT fund in here that may be helpful. The why we do it, I think one of the easiest and most relevant ways to answer that question is it's not just to confuse new legislators, although that
That's a good job.
may be part of it, but you know, really, this is a way that we can take shared activities or even demand-based activities that they're funded out of one place that needs to pay for that activity. We can now allocate it across funds, and that's where that's really what this is all about. We, you know, if you look at our, on an unduplicated basis, our FY 25, budget right now that's before you, it's about $9.0 billion total unduplicated, right? Out of that 9.0 billion, 3.1 billion is federal funds. There are accepted, GASB, which is Government Accounting Standards Board, you know, methodologies for allocating certain shared costs
Who gets appointed to the GASB board?
to federal funds. I would have to get our, Director of Statewide Reporting, John Becker, to answer that question.
I know John,
I stay out of those,
but that's a national board.
that's a national board,
And there's some people on it.
and there are people that actually have the inclination to participate in that sort of activity.
And they issue out new guidelines every year.
Not every year, but periodically there are changes, often referred to, you know, there's a whole set of rules, GASB 87 pertaining to, and things do change, not terribly dramatically. They changed, you know, the most recent change that's material, that is something that John Becker could give a seminar on, which I would probably have to listen to it too, to be honest, because I try to stay higher level. But for instance, when increasingly, and this is again having to do with IT costs, a lot of things are no longer like you buy an asset and buy software and own it, and it's sort of fixed asset kind of accounting. And we've got all these costs now that are like licensing their software as a service. And so the way all those costs need to be accounted for, you know, changed, and that's something that GASB would dictate, you know, new guidelines for, and so that's an example. Getting back to internal service funds, this method of duplicate appropriations, so we're paying the cash for, you know, we're paying the ADS staff, and we're paying the bills for the network backbone and the internet and the Ethernet and all that. We're paying it out of this fund, but it's really a duplicate appropriation, and then we're then taking that and allocating it out to all agencies and departments via an allocation mechanism. And then it actually takes place in the business office of each agency or department. They get the bill from ADS, and then they figure out how they're paying for it within their agency or department, and how much they can hang on federal funds, for instance. And that has to do with, you know, indirect rates that have been agreed upon, you know, with the federal government. But getting back to the, you know, why do we do this? We do this because this is the accepted way to allocate costs and spread them among. It also works for our own fund. We've got things we need to share. You know, the T fund needs to pay its share, and special funds need to pay their share as well. So it's really for the allocation across funds in a way that's compliant with.
Senator Lyons has a question.
Yeah, so I just stopped at the slide on property and commercial insurance fund.
Sure.
Allocated demand, and then I see how is it calculated, and it looks pretty complex. So just wondering what the human resources investment is in that calculation. How many people are there? Who's doing that? And is there any, you know, is there any transferability one agency or department to another in terms of expertise?
Sure, that's all done. So
All ADS.
No, so we're talking about when we're you're asking about the property and commercial insurance
Yeah,
fund,
just that
which
one.
it is more complex because
said
it's
that,
both
yeah.
allocated and demand. There's some individual policies, and then there are the statewide pieces that are allocated statewide. So this is, you know, under the purview of the risk management department in Agency of Administration, and we're lucky enough to have the Agency of Administration's Financial Services Division, which is led by CFO Holly Farron, and I see Jason Bernard from their office is on the line if we really wanted to get down into the weeds. He or one of his staff is really maintaining one spreadsheet, you know, on Excel, these costs that are the inputs, so the various policies and how much they cost, and then the formula for allocating them out. We did have someone who did that. Sean Benham left and moved on to work in AHS. So there was a need for internal knowledge transfer and someone else to pick up that task and continue doing it. But it went, essentially without a hitch. Within that office, that accounting office, that's a process that's managed.
So it's one person?
I'll ask if
Maybe-
Jason.
Yeah.
I think it's one person or one, and a backup would be my guess. Can you answer that, Jason?
Yeah, it's one person. It's Harmony Wilder, who's a financial director in our office, is the one who's along with Rebecca White from the Office of Risk Management. Together, they build that rate.
Okay, a lot of work. But it's ongoing. Once you get it set up, so it's getting it set up that was probably the.
That one, Senator Lyons, probably not one of the, because it's really just figuring out what the formula is.
Yes.
And knowing which policies only go to these rows on the spreadsheet based on demand, and then which ones need to be allocated. There's probably more kind of work than the allocation formula is looking at, for instance, the FSD will need to look at, okay, this year we actually paid out more than we took in, right? And so how are we we're going to now need to figure out what the trend is. Are we going to need to then increase the rate that we charge via the internal service fund to then make up for a deficit? On the last page of this handout, it shows all the funds and 5 years of history of revenue and expenses, and you'll see there are, you never get it exactly right. Some years you're going to collect more via your projection than is needed and generate a surplus. Some years you'll maybe go the other way, and we try to figure out the rates that we're going to charge departments and agencies to be fair. And in fact, we also have to make sure we get them so that we're not overcharging every year and generating surplus, because for federal audit purposes, what happens then is the feds say you're charging more than us, you're charging us more than you need to. We actually ran into this on retirement rate a few years ago. So that's some of what goes into it. Does that answer your question?
It does.
Okay.
I'm wondering how many of the, how many areas in the agency, in various agencies and departments they're all fully set up, and which ones are more difficult in terms of collecting the data each year and then making a determination. So, I mean,
probably
one person doing it all seems like a lot of work.
So, you know what, we've got, so on the insurance pieces, there's one person in FSD figuring out, okay, this is the amount. We've also got one person who has one of their many duties in my budget and management division in finance and management, which is 5 analysts and 1 director. One analyst handles all the internal service fund allocations. So they actually pull them all in and then communicate out to each department, okay, this is your ADS allocation is going to be this amount, your various insurances are going to be this. We get from FSD, okay, here's the total amount we need to collect for instance, liability insurance. Then we have another person in finance and management in my shop who then does the allocation and runs that spreadsheet and allocates it by a head count, and then our analysts make that communication. The good thing about the ISF allocation process is departments know what they're going to pay, and that's not going to change for next year in terms of the things we allocate. If it turns out that we didn't charge enough, then the following year we'll have to change it then. But it takes sort of the variability out of the agency and department side, so they at least know what they're going to get hit with And the variabilities now on, the underlying fund, whether it's insurance, or whether it's, the IT. What I would say in terms of complexity, and you may have gathered this, from yesterday's testimony from ADS, ADS is there's the most complexity going on there. And in large part because they have, essentially 4 different, recovery methods, 4 different billing methods. One of them is very straightforward. It's an allocation based on headcount. And that $12 million is pretty straightforward, and departments know what that's going to be for FY26. That's built into H493, and it's not an unknown. As they described, there are a number of additional complexities. For instance, the SLA billing, which is actually billed in arrears for the prior year, and the timesheet billing, which are more variable, and demand based. And
you didn't deal with all, I assume there's other ones, like this deals with just 9 biggest or the 9 principal.
Yeah, so, there are other funds that are technically internal service funds. They're on, 4th to last page here. So for instance, in BGS, the copy center fund, the postage fund, they're demand based, which means there's not a bill back unless you actually commission the copy center to copy something, and then you get a bill. And there's a postage, that's only billed back.
So this does most all of them. Like this doesn't have the SLA.
Oh, you're right. So that's on the previous page. SLA is not its own internal service fund. It's just one of the methods of billing. And you'll see it where it says service in the lower right-hand corner of the Communications and Information Technology Fund page. It'll say service category, and one of those methods is the demand-based SLA billing. So in SFY 25, 25 million is what was projected to bill out via that method. And then,
is that why we're trying to do the 15 million, when we're trying to
yeah, so
that SLA?
Yeah, so to give you the cliff notes on what's happening and what's with this transfer request, that demand SLA number for FY 26 actually goes up to about 30 million. So there's 30 million of costs that, if we keep doing things that according to current plan, that 30 million gets, billed out on a demand basis to agencies and departments using that service. ADS has proposed to take about half of that, about $15 million, and move it out of SLA up a few rows into the ADS allocation line, okay?
Which is a headcount.
Which is headcount based and much simpler, and it takes that variability out of it. It's not like it's gonna be more or less departments and agencies.
Did they recommend it, or did you come out of your?
What's that? They recommended it. They recommended it, and we're going along with it. We're supporting it, and we agreed that out of that $30 million pot of different services, that about $15 million would be reasonable.
And are they gonna ask for another 15 million next year?
I certainly hope not.
Okay.
Let me explain, I'll explain a little bit about how that.
Because they want to keep some SLA, they just want to reduce it.
Yeah. So this is based on our meetings with ADS. This has been a collaborative process between DFM and ADS. And we agree that about half of the $30 million SLA pot would be legitimate to allocate statewide. There are costs in there that it would be more straightforward and make sense. A lot of that is related to, out of that 15 million, I'd say about half of it is related to like data storage stuff.
Yeah.
That everybody, it's all in the cloud now, right? Everything's moved out to the cloud, and that's the way the expenses have shifted. People don't have their own servers anymore. Like we don't have you know, agencies and departments with their own servers.
We talked, there was one that came in because they had to replace their server, and I was surprised that they had one. But they did have one, I can't remember who it was.
That could, I mean, there are like a few mainframe-based systems that are really old, that are still out there, but I've heard in ADS's, in their annual report, in fact, they state they've moved everything into the cloud, like no more on-premises servers, and that's all out there. So about half of it is like that data and storage stuff. A big part of the 15 million is something like $8 million or so worth of Microsoft related, like Office 365. And so that's currently billed out, you know, each person in my department, it's actually billed out, okay, username, they've got an Office 365 license. There's a lot of complexity to have all that individual billing based on users, and people change. They want to make it simpler and go via an allocation. This is where, and this is also why, you know, we're not planning on the ADS making the full move to this core essential services big allocation model until 27, in part because
Well, that's why I thought they wanted $15 million. They wanted 15 million for FY 26 and another 15 million for 27.
No, we're not seeing a transfer, a general fund transfer in that amount. We're asking for a general fund transfer of 15 million in 26 to support the movement of those $15 million out of the SLA into allocation, which would actually take place in 27. And so the reason why is this: the SLA billing is billed in arrears. Right, yeah. So in FY 27, their plan is to actually, you know, just as this year, the SLA bills were sent out for the services, including Microsoft or Salesforce, whatever, that was utilized in FY 24. The bills being sent out now are for FY 24 services. So likewise, the bills being sent out in FY 27 for SLA, for that piece, they would be billing for the services actually received in FY 26. The problem is, if we now want to move half of the SLA stuff into the allocation in FY 27, departments and agencies are going to get the bill for their prior year SLAs of that 15 million. They're also going to get in FY 27, they're now going to start paying in same year out of the allocation. They would be double billed. So we would have this really, what seemed to us an intractable problem of getting out of this arrears billing to current year billing.
This transfer fixes.
So the transfer fixes it. What the transfer means is in FY 26, those services that would otherwise be billed in arrears in FY 27, ADS is going to pay them just out of their fund, and they won't need to bill back. They won't need to
BAA adjustment.
They won't need to recover on that in FY 27 because they've already paid those out of the fund's general fund transfer revenue. That means in FY 27, then, when we move to the large allocation, that'll increase by approximately 15 million, the idea is agencies and departments can afford to pay that bill. It's being billed in a different way, but they're not getting billed by the SLA.
We won't see that
as well.
We won't see it in the BAA.
Where there's, I think, concern about BAA is that the House made a reduction to the $15 million.
Right, well, that was going
to $10 million. So that would create a hole. That would.
Well, if that stayed, what would you do? Would you just have the SLA still have to do some billing in arrears, or have a deficit in that fund? In the CIP?
Well, it would create in FY 26. We've already essentially locked in the budget, so it would create a deficit. Okay, based on our current budget, we're not changing the current. You know, all the numbers in the budget are predominant, which are allocated among all agencies. Like, that's all locked in.
Right.
So what would happen if we pass a budget with the 10 million? It really wouldn't. What it would do is it would add 5 million to the deficit in FY 26, it would be an option to try to fix that in BAA if we had money. If we're so fortunate next year, I don't know how.
Or the next fiscal
Or the
year
next
budget.
year, it's an internal service fund.
Well, the hole's already there.
There already is a hole.
There already is the hole, so they just make a 2/3 down payment on paying it off.
Right, maybe that's what they're thinking, like, we'll do 2/3 down, the third next year or something.
Would it be a good idea to pay it all off? Yes, but if it didn't, we'll just carry a smaller hole than we already have.
Hard to carry a whole.
That's what we're doing already.
We are carrying a hole already.
And we
that's
fix
correct.
it though in the BA.
And we are trying with the changing, and the reason we support the change in the billing model is that hopefully we can develop, I think besides billing model, we'll be looking on the accounting side at trying to implement additional accounting controls as well. But we would like to move to a system where we feel confident that we can, over years, gradually be reducing the deficit like we do with other internal service funds like workers' comp that are we can get our heads around. We're not going to recover the deficit all in a single year by billing agencies and departments drastically more, but we will have a manageable program that we can reduce over time. We're hoping that the change to the new billing model will give us a more predictable and manageable system, with ADS that will reduce that deficit over time. However, the plan with the 15 million transfer and the change in billing model, that would not in and of itself mitigate any current deficit. And unfortunately, if we do 15 instead of 10, we would potentially be growing that deficit more, which we don't want to do.
Yeah. Okay.
That's a little bit of what I think I can say on that.
Well, I'm sure this weekend we're all gonna be reading this document.
At least put it,
I am.
I said reference, I didn't recommend reading it this weekend, but using it as a reference material, I do think you'll find it something useful at least once a year to
already
pull
found it.
out.
I'm gonna use it for bedtime sleeping.
Well,
Any other questions about internal service fund before we move on?
It might be too scary to read.
Yeah.
I might be dropping off halfway through the first page.
well, I thank you all for your patience and time and for staying awake for this half
No,
hour.
we appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure, and yep, take care.
Okay. JFO is next. Well, Emily is not on the
I know, we,
chalkboard.
Uh-oh.
yes, I know, we were fill-ins for Emily when she was gonna be busy with the budget, and so
She's not busy, so this is a rules change?
this is a rule change.
Suspension.
Oh, we have to roll, we have to vote on it.
Too soon?
Yeah. So do you want to give an introduction of why you're here?
Sure. I am Catherine Benham with the Joint Fiscal Office. Emily Burns, Joint Fiscal Office. And we are here today to talk about current law, what you do when revenues are short. And we want to set the groundwork for you today to just talk about current law because the House has some language in their bill that adds to current law. But for right now, we're just going to talk about what is current in statute, about how you deal with it when there are shortfalls. And it has happened over the years. So I think every year the Emergency Board adopts a revenue forecast in January and in July. And I'll just remind you, the Emergency Board is the governor and the 4 money chairs. And the 2 economists are Tom Cadet and Jeff Carr. Jeff Carr works for the administration, Tom Cadet works for the legislature, and they come to consensus and they have a consensus revenue forecast. And then the governor and you build off January forecast. That's the number we all use to build how much money you've got. It's great when times are good and revenues are coming in. It's hard when revenues don't match what the expectation was. And a rescission allows the state to reduce spending in case you don't have the revenues available.
Rescission and revision, that they're different. A rescission and a revision. Rescission is actually not taking money away, and revision is revising the budget.
So, and there, in current law, there are certain, we're calling them trigger points or set points. So if it's 1% or less, the revenues are 1% or
The
less.
total revenues, or is it per?
The reduction.
The reduction.
So if you take the January, we'll take the January forecast and then assume the next one is in July. If the change in those revenues is 1% or less
Of the bottom number.
of the individual funds.
So
General
transportation,
fund,
education, general.
transportation, yeah.
So
Correct.
but that's our revenues, not a loss in federal money.
We'll get to
But, no, I'm asking the
Well,
question
federal funds are
about the
mentioned in there,
statute
but
now.
the statute right now does talk about federal funds, but let's get to that in a second.
Because the federal funds are in the revenue forecast, are they not?
Right, they're in the July revenue forecast. And they are typically the amount that has been appropriated in the budget that has just been completed by the General Assembly in May or June or whenever it's
Thank you,
finally.
that's helpful.
But this 1% is only calculated when you get to the next 6 months, or could it be at any month you say, oh, the 1% has happened?
So if the emergency board is called back, and so if there is something happening in the economy, so we'll go back to 2008, right? Things are looking bad. The governor or the majority of the money share of the members of the E-board can call the E-board back to readopt the revenue forecast. So if there is some big economic thing going on and everybody knows that the revenue collections are not gonna match what we thought they were gonna be, recalls the emergency board and they adopt the new revenue forecast. It would be the difference between whatever was adopted, the most recent one, and then what is adopted. So if there's a decrease, that triggers a rescission process. If it's decreased.
Well, let me just say, one year, I can't remember, if it was 2008, we actually had them do a new revenue forecast in April. So the General Assembly was here and we had a new consensus forecast and everybody had to lower the budget. So that can happen in session. The issue is what happens when you all are not here. And that's what this law is addressing. So when you're not, so if you're in session and we have a new revenue forecast, we address it with the committee process. If you're not here, this is what happens. So it does talk about 1% for the general fund. I think it mentions federal funds, but federal funds are not forecasted in the same way.
But yes, and that's my sticking point here is because what we're really worried about right now is the drop in particularly federal Medicaid.
So the House proposal speaks to that. We wanted to just get you comfortable with what you got by law.
Right, but that's why I asked about this, because it's different than what their language would be a build off of what the present statute is.
Yes, exactly. The present statute does mention, I'm looking at it right now, it does mention federal funds, but because of how we do the estimate, it's not, Tom and Jeff don't estimate it, they just accept what has been budgeted. So that's the challenging part about federal funds. Go ahead.
Okay, sure. So if it's 1% or less, the Secretary of Administration can prepare an expenditure reduction plan to deal with that 1% reduction, but they can't do more than the revenue estimate reduction, and they can't take more than 5% of any one appropriation to deal with it. So they can't say like, okay, we're gonna eliminate the Department of Libraries to deal with this, right? Like they could only take 5% from up to 5% from a specific line item.
But they could, Secretary of Administration could make up the entire rescission from areas that they choose rather than following the proportionate appropriations.
Yes,
So it gives them a great deal of authority to pick and choose who loses in the event of rescission.
But to do that, you would need the approval of joint fiscal committee. That's the way I read it. You could just zero out one.
But that says cannot exceed without their approval.
So
Just the 5%.
So under
They could do
1%, right, under 1%.
You could do 4%.
Yes.
Freedom to go make those decisions. So it's just if it's 1% or less reduction. If the revenue forecast, we haven't got to more than that. So if it's under 1% of revenue reduction, the Secretary of Administration has the freedom there.
Yep, and I guess what I'm asking is, let's say that they want to reduce a series of departments by 4%. They pick which departments, and then as long as they don't go over 5%, they just have to file it with JFO. So that's
Well,
am I wrong? That's a huge amount of authority they have to redirect
but
the
but
spending.
the backup to that is, what if joint fiscal says no to their plan?
This doesn't say
This
they
says
have to.
under 1%, there's
If
no.
you-
Right, but that's,
So there is this trade-off when you all are talking about this, like, how much freedom do you let the administration, who's administering government? What point do you let them just deal with it? What
Yeah.
point do you come in and deal with it as the joint fiscal committee or whoever you want off session? At what point do you want the whole general assembly to come back? And each step is obviously involves more people and gets more complicated and bigger implications. So that's, so current law, we collectively, Vermont has chosen these places. These are sort of the set points for where you
Yeah.
should think about it. And when we get to the House language, which we're not doing today, but when we get to it, you'll see there are other ways of thinking about the House language as well.
Because to Senator Westman's point, the plan must be filed with the Joint Fiscal Office. But as I read it, it doesn't have to be approved by the Joint Fiscal Committee. So at that point, 100% of the authority about who's going to suffer in the reductions is with the administration.
It's up to 4% or 4.9%.
Yeah.
so can I ask, we had, oh, sorry.
My question is, how frequently have we used this in the past? Where have we seen this, sort of recent history?
2008, 2000.
In terms of the less than 1%,
Yeah,
I don't think that
it hasn't.
frequently,
Okay.
to my knowledge. We can do go back and double check, but the ones that are in 2008 or after, like during the 2008 crisis was when there was more conversations about rescissions, and then there was one in 2015 that the Joint Fiscal Committee approved, but.
So those are bigger than the 1%.
Those are bigger than
Whenever 1%. And you were.
We had a conflict during COVID where they brought a plan to us. We voted to disapprove it on joint fiscal, and and there was a balk in refusing to change. And I can't remember how we worked that out.
We can go look that up. We can track that down. But
Yeah, and Jane was in the middle of the negotiation to work that out, but we said no. They could have gone ahead without us, but there became a negotiation. And I can't
that wasn't
remember.
about ARPA money? Was that about?
I think it was about ARPA money.
That may have, we'll go track down and figure out the history on that.
But both of these, you would need to enact them, you need a new revenue estimate. You can't just do it because the revenue came in lower.
Correct, so like, right now, the revenue, it goes both directions, right? Right now, through the end of February, the revenue is performing above forecast. But in terms of what you have available to budget in FY '25, that revenue is not accessible because it has not been adopted as part of the revenue forecast. So the budget, balancing the budget is based on the revenue forecast number, regardless of sort of what's going on with actual collections. The opposite would be true. Until there is an adoption of a new revenue forecast, if revenues come in light, you don't have to make that adjustment until the next forecast is adopted.
And only a majority of the E-Board can call for a new revenue forecast?
For the governor.
The governor can just do a new revenue forecast on his or her own?
He
He
can
can call you back.
No, I mean, but you have to have a majority of the E-Board to vote to ask the economist to come up with a new estimate. Because you need a new estimate to make the reduction, so who can cause the accountants or the economists to do the new estimate?
I think the governor or a majority of the E-Board. So if the governor says, I want to call the E-Board to reduce.
Because the governor just call Jeff Carr and say, do a new one.
Well, that wouldn't be consensus.
Oh, he calls up Tom Cabet and Jeff Carr.
I mean, in my experience, when things are going sideways or not going well, everybody.
Sure, but I'm just wondering, like,
Yeah.
if somebody said, oh, we had 2 months in a row where revenues were lower, I think we should have a new revenue forecast. Can the governor just get a new revenue forecast, or does the E-Board have to agree?
E-Board is still have to adopt.
And I think that works for me under a contract with the Joint Fiscal Office. So before he'd have to, we would have to agree to.
So it has to be adopted, not just created, right?
Correct,
So then you do need a vote of the majority of the E-Board. Okay.
But that all is based on our revenues. what we're really worried about in this situation and what needs to be tightened up is the federal.
So I'm gonna just say to you, yes, we were concerned about federal, but it's pretty unclear what the economy is gonna do. And I would say there's a lot of uncertainty, and now we talked to Tom Cavett, and he said that the risk is all down. So it may not just be federal funds.
Well, I understand that,
So,
and he may be right in everything, but right now, the next 90 days and beyond that, you know, we know that Congress is working to reduce Medicaid particularly, but across the board, that's the place where the biggest risk is for us.
I agree with you, there's big risk there, and I would say to you also, in terms of talking to Tom, it's too uncertain right now for him to do a new revenue forecast.
Yep.
But he would, I don't know in the summer, you know, I don't know what the July forecast will hold. And so I think you should think about it. I think the current law provisions are important, as well as the addressing federal.
But, so we get to, can I?
Sure.
So we get to September or October. We know, we see a federal budget coming. We're out of session, and the federal cuts are a couple $100 million or better. I wanna, that isn't even just an estimate.
But Rich, what I'd love to do is walk through the current law.
Sorry.
Everybody-
Go ahead.
You know so much more than the rest, so let's get everybody comfortable.
Don't let them.
And
Oh,
so
yeah.
then we can come back to, and then the House language will make more sense.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Sorry for knowing more than we all.
Well, he's lived it, a lot of,
Yeah, he's the only one here that went through this.
been through,
I've been through it.
2008,
It was after
90.
9/11. I was actually here in the early 90s when, and we created the systems that we created because of 1991.
right.
He was here when the last state house burned down. But just, I know you want to get through this, you thought a 2-pager would not
Yeah,
take this long,
yeah,
but,
that's okay.
I'm sorry.
That's
but,
okay.
but to Weston's point, even though the federal funds could be larger, they would be accounted in here if they were budgeted for, and they didn't come in, because then the budget would be under. Wouldn't it be, or would it not show up in that fiscal, when we're looking at the revenue numbers for the 3 funds, and if they're under 1%, if we didn't get the federal funds, wouldn't that show up there, or would that not show up?
Well, the way they adopt the federal funds, not really. No,
Okay.
they're just, if you go look at what the minutes show, what they've adopted, it's really
It's really just the
FY
taxes.
25, this
and
is the
fees.
federal.
It's not the federal money.
Well, it is the federal money, but it's just the appropriation.
It's the amount that was appropriated in that.
So that would always be there,
Mhm.
right, until, okay, thank you.
Right, so I think,
Center lines.
Just really quickly, so it would be helpful to go through this. Is the goal today just to listen to this, or are we making any decisions? Are you bringing us a decision-making?
no decisions
Something,
today.
okay.
This is actually just information
Okay,
for you to understand the construct for how we've dealt with things in the past and how you've decided who has authority to do what. After today, we'll come back and talk to you about what the House did, speaking to the federal funds, because it's not, they addressed it and the emergency board, and then you guys you'll have decision points. Do you agree with that? Or like that day?
Did they change the underlying statute, or just kind of bolted a new section on?
They added they changed them, they mainly added, but they changed a few places, but they mainly added.
Sure. So if it's between 1% and 4%, then the Secretary of Administration has to prepare a plan for the Joint Fiscal Committee. They have 21 days to do it, 3 weeks. And then Joint Fiscal Committee reviews it. If they approve it, then off the races. If they don't, the Secretary has 2 weeks to update the plan and do it again. This is the last part is you have to have a public hearing about the research plan.
At the risk of seeming like I'm kidding or not, what happens if that second plan is moved? If we've had standoffs where,
Yeah, I think the 14 days keeps applying, but I have to go back.
Okay.
And in 2008, I was just looking at, we had many meetings, Joint Fiscal Committee had many meetings. And So I think it continues.
So 2 weeks could go by, they reject it, but give maybe guidelines for a new iteration of it, and, okay.
I mean, I think that what's, you've got, I mean, you will be providing feedback, and hearing testimony, people will be testifying, saying, you know, what they don't like about the cuts, and,
Yeah.
And,
like,
yeah, I think in 2015, when Amy and I were over at Finance and Management, I think it was more of a like, we don't like these 6 things, we ran back and tweaked it and came back, and then it was agreed to.
Okay.
And I think like for context too, right, like the administration has no ability to change the law when implementing the rescission plan, right? So like when you're talking about a rescission plan, it's really like the sort of first places you go are, what do we have for carry forward from last year that we can revert to balance it? What, you know, things that are new in the most recent year can we do to like, you know, eliminate program, right, if it's in the law. So it's not like they can sort of wholesale get rid of things, they have to, you know. It's a lot of trying to find money under couch cushions in my experience when a rescission plan comes forward.
Can I go back to the 14 days, because I'm looking at the statute, it says if the secretary's, final plan, then during the 14, if the committee fails to approve or disapprove the plan, by majority vote, the plan may be deemed disapproved. So I think we would want to involve the attorneys, large counsel in deciding what the next, Senator Brooks, what the timing would be on that.
Okay.
And if it's over 4%, there's nothing really written in the statute, but presumably the General Assembly would have to reconvene to figure out what to do if there was a bigger hit than 4%. And then the emergency board also has some authority. So the emergency board can make expenditures necessitated by an unforeseen emergency and transfer funds appropriated. So we have seen this in the last 2 years, where the emergency board has transferred appropriations to deal with the impacts of the floods in July. So this was I don't want to say it's the infamous $20 million in the treasurer's office, but it feels like that's what it's becoming. The $14 million that came out in the emergency board that went back to the but that transfer of appropriations, right, was made to stand up some programs to try to help communities that were impacted by the flood. And they can only do up to 2% of current year general fund appropriations, so they have a sort of maximum of about $44 million that can be moved. That can be moved by the emergency board. And the little table below gives you just sort of like how much money that is. So, you know, when we're talking about the general fund, a 4% reduction is in the neighborhood of $91 million. A 1% is in the neighborhood of $23 million.
So to your point about what the 1%, you know, on the transportation fund, it's $3 million. Education fund is $7 million, but in the general fund, so that's where you have given the Secretary of Administration the ability to move things around is under those amounts.
Yep.
It can't be greater than that revenue demonstrated, so.
That's right, you can't
In
cut
addition
more
to
than
the
the revenue,
percent.
yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Was that number ever higher?
What number?
The 1%.
Somehow in the back of my mind, I think when we had during the Great Recession, we might have increased that to 5 or 7%.
From the 4%?
From the 4.
We can go back and look at that.
So you have federal funds in that chart, but that's more of a information. If the emergency board wanted to move money around to their 2%, but it's not for triggering the 1% or the 4%.
I think in the way the law is written, it does. In practice, it doesn't, because Tom and Jeff are not creating. There isn't a consensus new forecast for the upcoming year. Just to be clear, on the emergency board is limited to 2% of the general fund. So that it's not fund by fund. They're just stuck at 40 million at the maximum. There are different pieces to this, and keeping track of the funds is a challenge.
Right, and you would never do something like move general fund into the federal fund, right? You would maybe reallocate general fund to pay for a thing that was formerly paid for with federal funds, but there's never a scenario where you would move state money into the federal funding space. That would be bad.
As an example for now, is if our revenue forecast holds, because just Vermont economy is doing okay, but we get an announcement that the feds are gonna send us $200 million less. Neither of these measures are applicable, and that's kind of what the House is trying to address, that situation.
That's what you're
That's
And
what I'm
that'll
worried
be
about.
part 2 of your
Yes.
presentation.
Yeah, but not today.
Not today.
So that's called rescission reload. Okay.
That's called a cliffhanger.
Yes, and I
Next
want-
season.
Yeah, thinking about this, over 4% possibility where the General Assembly must reconvene. Just that, as a practical matter, I mean, it makes sense to have, say, the appropriations committees or Ways and Means reconvene, and that I guess I don't know how that would work, practically, because everybody isn't necessarily coming back to discuss this, but then they should be back when we come back for, to present some kind of a revised budget.
It's like a special session. and
Yeah,
right.
Everybody's called back as the institution,
Mhm.
because we have no authority at that point until we all come back.
Okay.
So we could come back,
These meetings.
Yeah,
Mhm.
but
We could come
policy
back and
committees
adjourn.
are gonna
we
want
could come
to.
back and say, oh, appropriations, the money committees are gonna work on this for a week, and then.
Everybody else go.
But policy committees are gonna wanna weigh in. I mean, so if it's Medicaid, and then and you wanna fill in some holes
Yeah.
there, and it's all gonna come from transportation, that probably won't
Yeah.
go well with transportation.
Don't tell the chair. Chair.
I won't tell the chair.
I would say in this, you had a garage in Franklin County where they moved out of line items.
Yeah.
We've got about $100 million in projects on hold in transportation. I'm somewhat loath to let the administration make, switch around in construction all of those projects and not include the legislature in the decision. For you, one of the projects that's on hold is the bridge between Winooski and Burlington at $28 million. Do we want them making that decision alone?
No.
That bridge needs to be fixed. I'm not
Read
going
it.
over it.
More than that. I'm not going.
I'm just, I don't know how we want us to weigh in on that too. Because normally what it has been within the, construction budget is the Agency of Transportation just gets to move stuff. Because
Did
it's
you
within
look at-
appropriations.
Within a limit.
Did you look at what other states are doing, assuming that this is an issue all states are?
Yes, we're talking to NCSL on Monday, actually, and I think everybody is sort of looking to see what everybody else is doing, and I think, they were interested in hearing about the language that the House has put on the table, because it's sort of one of the first things that somebody's actually done, and I think to see how do you address this, and again, think about, I think you want to allow the administration some limited flexibility to deal with the issues, but at some point you want to bring back, and the way you have it set up now is they have a little bit of room, whether it's the right amount or not, but there's some space. Then you have the Joint Fiscal Committee weighing in, and then you have the General Assembly coming back. And so the question for you all is, what is the right place to, if you follow that pattern, what are the right places to have that happen? When do you want the Joint Fiscal Committee involved? When do you want the whole General Assembly involved? And I think that's, and the Emergency Board. And so those are all things that we will be need to think about it.
I'm gonna throw this out there, even though this is probably really presentation 2.0, I think the hardest thing that's to figure out is, right, it's not like, with probably what's coming on the federal side, it's not like there's a revenue forecast and there's another revenue forecast and then you subtract the two numbers and that's the problem. It's if this comes in chunks, what happens? And if we hear about some in May and then more in July and then something else in October,
Different program.
what happens? How it all what triggers what, and how do you add them together, and how do you deal with it? Will be a whole thing. Potential, or not,
Yeah, no,
I don't know.
I think we need to prepare for that situation.
Right, that's the goal.
Right.
And we did that during the pandemic. We had, in 2020, we had a extraordinary
We did a quarter budget,
Yeah,
and
Right.
then we came back and did the 3, because we didn't know what was happening,
Right.
right? And we met a lot.
yeah. And
Yeah, that was weird. And it was all on Zoom.
That's okay. When you're meeting a lot in the middle of the summer, Zoom sounds
Well,
good.
you know, I'm just gonna throw this out there, is a separate thing to the joint fiscal, instead of bringing the whole legislature back, we might bring back the money committees and then have a 2-day thing on Zoom in September to, or some
Leave the
workaround.
policy
Well,
committee.
I do
Joint
get,
fiscal.
I mean, we already have, joint fiscal, and we have, the E-board.
Yeah.
We have joint fiscal committee. So I feel like there's a lot of power in emergencies already concentrated in a few hands. If we change it so that the whole legislature doesn't come back for the higher amounts,
I think they have to come
Yeah.
back for the higher.
you're
amount.
saying then send the people home to learn on money.
Well, or, I think there's varying scenarios on
Yeah.
how you up the ante to get people back here.
Yeah. No, and I definitely think at whatever, $40,000 or $50,000 a day, once that the General Assembly comes back, you have to immediately start thinking, it's gonna be long-term at all, how do you reduce that number? But I also agree that it should be at that higher amount, that the whole General Assembly has to come back, and then that authorizes
Well, but-
whatever happens.
But the question is, how would you bring them back? You know, we do have the Zoom option to let people,
I see what you're saying. So could we change our rules to go back to allowing, we could, but it would be a kind of a detailed process. That's something to think about if we do a September or October session. Maybe we, in the same resolution, we allow the rules that were in place in 2020 to come back just for that session.
I would only say for myself, I'd figure out a way to make it happen, but when you have to work for a living.
Yeah.
And you cut into how do you make sure that people get to vote on these, but be as respectful as you can to them living there.
Yeah. I will say the House has been more resistant of the two bodies to remote voting in committee and out of committee. So anyway, we're deep in the weeds. Pretty much.
Well, they
Okay,
did it during COVID.
yeah, they did. Wasn't fun.
Speak for yourself.
So for the house, for the.
I've been hearing rumors that we're gonna hear of something on the federal level in May sometime.
That would be great.
I don't know if that's gonna happen. I don't know that we're gonna, and I think Emily raises a great point about that you also need to think about what happens if something happens in May and then July and then September and then October so it's not quite, it's not like waiting for one federal bill, it just drops and then you know sort of where you're landing. This feels like it's gonna be a combination of unexpected.
I would.
Slow rolling.
I agree with that, but I think the real cliff comes in the federal budget comes in October.
If they can pass one.
If they can pass.
And I think we'll know ahead of that where they're landing, right? We'll have a good sense of that, but, yeah. And so you will see, when we get to that again, you will see where the House suggested drawing from different lines also and how they're proposing it and that, we'll get to.
Senator Watson.
Well, and is a part of that some kind of cumulative drops?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember, they did this, something on the federal, they have a federal drop on what was appropriated, so what you've appropriated, and then, I'm trying to remember the other. There's been a lot.
So there's one in January, there's a forecast in January, there's a forecast in July.
Yes, officially, and we have done other revenue forecasting times that you need
Right.
one. Again, the forecasts as we have done them, the federal funds piece doesn't
play,
really work
yeah.
the same way. The general fund does, so if the economy is booming or tanking, that works for transportation fund or the education fund, but the federal funds piece. So they put in this provision about,
This one, 1% or more reduction in total federal funds anticipated in the most recent fiscal year.
So these are the good things, 1%.
Because if someone were to, say, request a forecast, if in a, forecast plus, that included the federal money that
Tom and Jeff don't
okay.
forecast, I mean, it's been so
Yeah.
consistent in the, like, it just has been, you've applied for a grant, your agency got a grant, and so you're calling that federal funds. It's just not been,
And I think,
go ahead.
not to get too far out of my swim lane in terms of how federal funds work, but sort of drawing on my previous experience, right? So the federal fund, like, not only is the federal fiscal year and the state fiscal year not the same fiscal year, right? So first, when you're building the budget, you have to make assumptions about, like, okay, like, what the timeline is between the two fiscal years, plus often, like, it all depends on what the federal funding stream is itself, right? Whether or not it's a competitive grant or discretionary grant, mandatory, whether or not it's a competitive thing, whether or not it's everybody gets it, whether or not it's like we go back to when I was at Agency of Education, some of those grants were 2-year grant. You had 2 years to spend the money, right? So now you have to get the amount that the agency would appropriate was sort of anticipating how much of those sort of 2 years worth of funds the districts themselves were gonna spend, right? Because the districts are the ones who are deciding like how much goes out when, and then you have to overlay that with the fiscal years themselves, and are they spending, sometimes you're spending last year's federal funding in the current fiscal year, but you have next year's becomes authorized, so then there's also this, like, it's not as simple as like, the federal government says, you have $1 million this year. The federal government may say, you have $5 million over the next 5 years, and the sort of rate at which you spend that is different depending on what you have going on. So if you're a department business manager, you're trying to figure out like, okay, we're gonna do this project this year, we're gonna spend more in the second year and then less in the third year, and so like, what's actually going, so a lot of like on the ups and downs, a lot of those federal funding changes is what you're seeing is sort of them implementing those grants, how it's gonna fluctuate, what other things are sort of going on. So in terms of anticipating what the federal funds are gonna be, it's really gonna depend on like where the federal government hits the off button, right? Like if they say, we've already authorized it, but we're canceling it, that's one thing. If they're saying, we're not gonna authorize it in the future, but any money that you've already been authorized, you get to keep, that's a different situation, right? So it's also gonna be sort of playing out all of those like individual funding stream scenarios in terms of how it impacts, and like how does that tie back to what has been appropriated by the General Assembly, right? And like what the anticipated spending is by agencies and departments based on these things.
Well,
That's like very in the weeds.
I would say buried in the weeds, for Medicaid itself, they're the ones that are gonna have the information about what's being cut, not Tom Cadet or Jeff Carr. And they're just gonna regurgitate what Diva's gonna tell them, because Diva's the one that's gonna know firsthand what that is. So it's a different process.
Well, I guess I'm raising this question about how often do you reassess? Like if we have to reassess the federal situation, if we know it's gonna keep changing, do you come up with a new plan and then 2 months later we have to come up with another new plan? And so,
Well,
I guess I'm just thinking about the interval, like
well,
how.
but with that, who sets the triggers?
Mhm.
If it's Diva that is the place that it's a different estimate than the consensus forecast when you get the two economists sat down in front of the E-board. It's a different process.
And the other challenging thing about this is you've got big programs with federal money, Medicaid, you've got some very small libraries is primarily funded with federal money, but it's a small, so as you think through this, you've got to think about these small departments that are heavily funded. You've also got massive programs that have a lot of federal money, and so you're trying to keep both of those in mind as you work through what language you want to have. And you certainly, I think, I'm gonna just say, because you all supported the libraries, that you don't want the libraries to disappear completely. So it wouldn't be much money in the overall scheme of things to take away their federal money. It would be a small piece, but it would be a big piece for them. They're so insignificant compared to Medicaid, but they're both important. And so figuring out how you set up a system that works for both the big and the small is part of the discussion.
I know, like, yeah, discretionary federal grants that we get on a one-time basis for a certain period of time versus the levers that they can pull on things like Medicaid, right? Like are very different, right? If they change eligibility or the match rates or sort of any of those big things, it's a different conversation from like, we got a 5-year grant and they canceled a 5-year grant. What are the implications of that? We've never had it before, or we're never gonna get it again. You know, do you backfill it or not? Maybe.
Okay, do you want to say anything about the email you sent out that's sort of related to this?
Oh, yeah, so I sent an email to everybody. We have a page on the Joint Fiscal Office with federal fund information. We're posting, the administration's put out some releases. We've got some studies up there. It's a live page trying to collect federal fund impacts and implications for us. So I sent an email with a link, and feel free to go there, and it will continue to
Can you
change.
break it up into sections, natural resources or section?
Yeah, and there's, and we're looking for, I'm not posting news articles. I'm really trying to look for original sources of information on it. And there's a couple studies on Medicaid, national studies with 3 big organizations separately looked at what happens with the post-Medicaid cuts and what it means for the economy, what it means for jobs. So it's not a Vermont specific thing, but it is, starts to give you a sense about the scale of what it could be. Yeah, and so it will, again, we will continue to add resources to it as we get them.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful, I think. Any other questions, any other info? So you'll be back, or this will be part of the whole? You'll be back.
Yes.
Are you gonna do a special?
I think you probably should
thing?
have a discussion about what to do and how to think about it. And,
Catherine and Emily precision show?
Probably, and maybe Bryn.
yeah, I think I would bring Bryn in on that.
Okay, so we'll schedule that as part of our looking at the 2493. Okay, well, with that, if there's nothing more we can